you all. My name is Mike Higton. I'm the academic lead on Common Awards from the Durham University side, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this webinar today. I'll just do a couple of practicalities and then introduce our speaker. I spoke too soon about the flow of people slowing down, but I'll just let them in as we go. One thing I should say is we are recording this meeting, and a video of it will go up online a little bit further down, probably in a couple of weeks' time by the time we get there. Just to be aware of that when you're asking questions and things. We try to edit it so that people's pictures don't appear online, but if you ask a question, your question will be recorded for posterity. I don't think I had any other practicalities. This is the last of our webinars for this year, so there's no notices to give about what's coming up. So I think we can launch straight into this one. It's my very great pleasure to be hosting today Stephen Campbell, who's Disability Service Manager at Leeds Trinity University, and who has written an excellent book on supporting disabled students in higher education. You should have had some information about that in the advert that we sent round about this. And it's a book specifically about making reasonable adjustments. The subtitle is The Reasonable Adjustments Handbook. And given how much conversation there's been around the Common Awards Partnership about reasonable adjustments and people asking, what is reasonable? How do reasonable adjustments work? We were very eager to invite Stephen to come and talk to us and help us think through this area. Obviously, Stephen's experience is in a slightly different area from the theological education institutions, but a lot of the same ideas and lessons will transfer across. So, Stephen, it's great to have you here today. The way we're going to arrange things is I'm going to ask Stephen a set of questions, sort of going through some of the fantastic ideas in that book. Don't know exactly how long that will take, but perhaps 3/4 of an hour or so. We'll take a short break after that, and then when we come back from that break, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions, and we'll see how the conversation goes from that point, and we'll finish by 3:30. So, are there any, just before we get going, are there any concerns or questions just about the practicalities or how things are working before I get going? Do stick your electronic hand up if you've got a problem. No. Okay. In that case, Stephen, welcome.
Thank you.
So our topic today is, as I've said, making reasonable adjustments for disabled students. And a first, perhaps basic but important question then is simply about what do you mean by disabled students? Who are we talking about?
Yeah, that's actually quite a deceptively simple question, because I think we all sort of know what we mean by student, or we think we know what we mean by student. So we'll start with student first, because it can actually take some unpacking, and it will become apparent why. So when we tend to think of students, we generally tend, in higher education, we generally tend to default to usually undergraduate or postgraduate students aged between 18, 21, or slightly older if they're postgraduate students. But this sort of belies the reality of higher education, increasingly so. So yeah, student is literally anyone registered on a higher education course being delivered by a recognised higher education institution, and who are expected to complete a course of study from level 4 upwards and will include undergraduate, postgraduate studies, therefore student. But student can also mean, for example, students on apprentices, apprenticeship degrees. Students can also, student can also mean people doing work-based training. Students can also mean postgraduate studies, where most of the course is done vocationally, for example. So the idea of being a student is slightly at variance with, I think, most people's sort of idea about what a student traditionally is. Now, this is quite important insofar as putting support and student support and disability support in place, because if we take, for example, apprentice students or vocational learners who are doing higher education courses, who are disabled, and of whom we have many, then the terminology becomes a matter of how do they identify. So we have a number of students who are registered with West Yorkshire Police. We do the police degree apprenticeship training for West Yorkshire Police and recently West Midlands Police. And I think if we asked those cohorts, what do you do? All of them, without exception, I'm guessing, would say, I'm a police officer. They wouldn't say I'm a student. Now that raises some problems, and this is what we've found is if I got a lot of students who don't identify as being a student, generally tends to see the institution, the university or the HEI as a degree awarding body, like an exam board, for example. So they don't necessarily equate their course with them being part of a broader community of students. So to ask what is a disabled student, it's like, well, okay, the first, what is a student? And then secondly, do the students even identify as being a student? And then if they don't identify as being a student, where do they identify if they have a disability or a long-term medical condition or a learning difficulty, for example? So self-identification is important in that respect. And so is the realization that within the student body there is incredible diversity, if only because of the courses that they're on, never mind the issue of, let's say, widening participation. So if this sort of diversity exists within student cohorts, then how much more diverse, does it become with disabled students? So when we say what's a disabled student, then let's say that we have, students who do identify as being students. It's like, well, what do we mean by disabled students? So that rather sort of depends on what is your understanding of disability, and what is your understanding of disabled. Now, what I usually do when I'm talking about disability, I don't assume that anybody knows a great deal about it, but I also can't assume that everybody comes into this, completely without any knowledge of disability. So what I'll do is I'll briefly sort of mention the two main models of disability, which some of you will probably know, some of you might know, some of you have probably heard of before, depending on what your backgrounds are. But there's two different ways, well, there's multiple ways, but there's two primary ways of conceiving about disability. There's what's called the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. Now, the medical model states that a person is disabled because of the condition that they have, that their disablement is because they're in a wheelchair or they have a recognized condition which has been diagnosed, that they are disabled simply because of something intrinsic to themselves. The social model came about usually from about the 1960s and 1970s, when disability activists in the UK and the US took their cue from the civil rights movement, mostly in America and then throughout the rest of Europe, where they actually said, no. What the medical model does by positing disability as something that experts, have a great deal of power over, is to say that we are disempowered as a marginalized group. So the social model of disability separates the disablement from the impairment. So the impairment is the condition that the individual has, but the disablement occurs at an institutional level. So the disablement occurs at the point at which possibly there is the likelihood of discrimination, the likelihood of exclusion, the likelihood of marginalization. So a disabled student is somebody who is identifying or is actually a student and is somebody who has a condition or suspected to have a condition which is medical or psychological or mental health, for example, of which they are likely to be excluded from a particular environment because there are no accommodations in place to ensure that they are not discriminated against. So that is what is a disabled student in a very sort of theoretical, conceptual way.
Thank you. So yeah, that gives us the sort of material on which we're going to be focusing. Now, there are obviously many good reasons for wanting to make excellent provision for disabled students to overcome that disablement that you've been talking about. But one of those, I'm aware there's a legal framework surrounding reasonable adjustments. Could you explain what our legal obligation is as educators in this area?
Yeah, it's recently become a bit more complicated. So I'll either simplify it as much as I can or explain why it's complicated. So we'll see how it goes. So the first introduction of anti-disabled legislation occurred in 1995 with the Disability Discrimination Act. And that was the first piece of legislation which specifically stated that it would be illegal to discriminate against disabled individuals. So when you consider that I went to university for my original undergraduate degree, 93 to 96, basically it would have been perfectly legal for the university that I attended to say to a student, we don't think you can do this course because you say you have dyslexia and there's nothing you can do about it. We're not going to make any provisions because we're not going to provide a ramp, etc. In 2010, the Disability Discrimination Act was subsumed into the broader Equality Act 2010, which is where we are now in terms of our legislation. Now, the Equality Act specifically states that institutions, whether it's universities, schools, workplaces, for example, and organizations, need to put in place what's called reasonable adjustments for the purpose of including disabled students, or again, not marginalizing them. So you can see where the social model has had a direct influence on this. And the Disability Discrimination Act says, and I've got it written down here, which is why I'm looking at my notes, that you are disabled under the Equality Act if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. Now, again, it's quite vaguely worded, which means that it can be open to interpretation. But what does substantial and long-term mean? So substantial means is more than a minor or trivial condition. So for example, it takes longer than it normally would to complete a daily task like getting dressed. But again, applied to higher education, you think, well, does that, if we have exam anxiety, for example, is that a disability, under the Equality Act? If we have somebody, with a food allergy, to what extent are they, where does the disablement occur? If we have somebody with a diagnosed condition, but it's symptomless, at what point, do we identify, where those pressure points are, for exclusion to occur? So again, you need to think kind of laterally as to how it applies in individual circumstances. And long-term means 12 months or more. For example, a breathing condition that develops as a result of a lung infection. And again, we get students who say, I have hay fever and food allergies. Is that a disability? Well, it sort of depends. We need to look at it from an individual point of view. But essentially, that's what the law says. Now, with regard to the interpretation of that law, I think what's happened over the past, let's say, 20 years, since a bit longer than that, actually, I'm showing my age, since the 95 Disability Discrimination Act, was said increasingly since the 2010 Equality Act, we're seeing a much greater awareness of the need for disabled students to be included within particularly higher education, and because it's coincided with a lot of institutions' commitment to widening participation. Now, and I think this is an issue of higher education generally, that at what point does diversity begin and end? Does it just begin at the point of recruitment, but what happens after that? So if we say that we're going to recruit more disabled students, then what do we do? What's our legal responsibilities from there on in? So disability services, not just here at Leeds Trinity, but at other universities as well, their central role is to act as almost a conduit between the student and the academic department and other services to say, this is what we would recommend as a legal requirement for the students to be accepted into the university. This is how we will coordinate that support as well. And these are the reasons why, because any recommendation that we would make as an adjustment to accommodate that student, we are confident that it is compliant with the Equality Act. So when I make what we call student inclusion plans for our students, and I will send them to academic departments, then I'm pretty sure that I'm making something that is compliant with the law and is appropriate for the student. But if we get kickback as occasionally happens, or it's challenged, or there's a need for greater interpretation or exploration of some of those accommodations under the Equality Act, then we have to say, well, you tell us why you think we're being unreasonable. You tell us why you think that this isn't appropriate for that student, of which there could be legitimate reasons that we hadn't discovered. Now, the reasons why it's more complicated, and again, I'm going to have to give a content warning here because I'm about to talk about the Natasha Abrahart case from a couple of years ago about the student who took her own life. So apologies if I'm going into some sensitive areas. But the Natasha Abrahart case was brought about by a student who unfortunately took her own life, and she was studying physics at the University of Bristol. And she had declared that she had very high levels of anxiety to her university, and it had been suggested to her academic department that they put in place reasonable adjustments with regard to exam adjustments, very specifically to remove the requirement for her to give a presentation to the full cohort of her year. She said that that would be absolutely impossible for her because of the nature of her disability. The academic department disagreed. She was required to undertake that particular form of assessment, and it got too much for her. Her family took the university to court under the Equality Act because they said that the university was in breach of the Equality Act because it failed to put in place reasonable adjustments. The university argued that actually, no, that was a competent standard. That's what we expect of all students to be able to do. But the judge disagreed and said, no, it wasn't a competent standard. It was an assessment procedure. There was a difference. And the absence of any alternative assessment, essentially was in breach of that student's human rights. The judge came down in favour of the family. And at that point, in nearly every university across the UK sort of took note of this and said, oof, what are the implications of this? The university then appealed, and the second judge in the appeals court came down even harder on the university. And obviously, because of the findings of the original court case and the appeal, there are now so many more recommendations that we would need to put in place for the purpose of what our legal requirements are for the support of disabled students. This is given greater impetus because the Equality and Human Rights Commission are now increasingly becoming active in how they assess the provision of support for disabled students. So as an example, if we look at the legal ruling, and this is sort of where, because what usually happens is the Equality Act is sort of interpreted by disability services, and then the support is perceived to be centralised within one department, who then tell other departments what to do. But what the Abrahart case highlighted was the fact that that's an issue. Legally, that's an issue because of the fact that it means that some students may be disadvantaged or discriminated against because of the fact that there are multiple occasions when they are required to make disclosures about their disability. Now, what the ruling said is, if a university staff observe, so that's any member of staff, that a student has a disability which is having a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal daily tasks or everyday academic tasks, then the staff have a responsibility to seek advice or disseminate information when clear evidence of the disability is disclosed or observed. And basically now what we're saying is what a student says or even is observed to do is considered as evidence of a disability, or at the very least, the evidence of support measures to be put in place. How that works operationally is sort of what we're all looking at the moment. But you can kind of see now where the Equality Act says that it's an institutional responsibility to ensure that disabled students are included. But the Abrahart case has highlighted that it's not just one department within an institution, it's now every single individual who works in that institution has a responsibility to ensure that disabled students are included. So you can see why it's kind of complex, and why, the idea that disability services is the only service that concentrates that support sort of isn't the the case anymore. So that's sort of where we are legally with regard to our legal obligations, and where we are in the light of the further guidelines that have come in the event of the Bristol versus Abrahart case.
Thanks for that. So a key word in what you've been saying there and in the legislation is reasonable, and we're going to be digging into some detailed examples later on which will help fill this out. But I wonder if you can say anything in general about sort of who gets to decide what is reasonable and how?
Yeah, again, that's it. It's a question of which there is no one answer, because I think one thing that you can probably kind of discern at the moment is that if we have reasonable adjustments, and the phrase reasonable adjustment is in the Equality Act, so that's the term that we often have to use. But if there is such a thing as reasonable adjustments, then it implies the existence of unreasonable adjustments, and that's often where the contentions arise when we have students with multiple disabilities or more complex needs. So who decides? Okay, so if we talk about, for example, students with what we would normally say non-complex needs. So we'll say, for example, a student with a diagnosis of dyslexia studying a humanities degree in which there are a combination of lectures and seminars and assignments and assessments. A reasonable adjustment, which is almost so standard now that people don't even recognize it as adjustment, would be permission to record teaching sessions, if not already done so, extra time for assignments, upon request, if not given automatically, additional time for exams, usually 25%. 25% is the standard. I do not know where the 25% came from, but that seems to be the standard recommendation. And access to possibly some one-to-one catch-up sessions with tutors subject to time and availability. That's, if you like, a standard package. On top of that, there are other support measures that might be in place. So, for example, the student might request, let's say, the use of a computer in the exam instead of, handwritten, if, let's say, their dyslexia is comorbid with dyspraxia. Or we could say, well, here's some access to some assistive technology packages like a screen reader or voice to text. That's reasonable. It's like nobody would say, look, nothing's been undermined here. Nothing, the integrity of the academic program, isn't being questioned here. Because a student, with a slow reading process and slower than average handwriting is being given a bit more time to sort of demonstrate what he already knows. Now, if it becomes a bit unreasonable, or there's the potential for it to be unreasonable, then we need to make a determination as to how that's made. So we need to look at this in a number of ways, because there'll be increasingly a number of stakeholders involved in any recommendations that we would make for an adjustment for a student. So, for example, we have recently had a few students with multiple disabilities on the same degree, and they have required alternative assessments. So, right, alternative assessments. We're currently, as an institution, working towards having embedded within the curriculum a choice of assessments for students on particular modules as much as possible, as an anticipatory reasonable adjustment, but that's not possible at the moment for all students on all courses. But on this particular module, we had a number of students who were required to take a 3-hour exam. And again, we found ourselves in a Natasha Abrahart case because a few of the students had very high anxiety, very, very difficult mental health difficult problems, which would have prevented them from sitting for 3 hours in either a lecture hall or a smaller room with fewer students. And so they had specifically requested alternative assessment. It's like, well, okay, then in theory that's possible, but what does it look like and who would need to be involved? So who makes that decision? And again, this is something that I've actually sort of had to talk to our assessment team and our senior executive team about, simply because, well, where in that process is the decision made, and who takes ownership for it? So I could write on the student inclusion plan a recommendation to say alternative assessments should be considered if it becomes apparent that the student's disability is preventing them from demonstrating the full extent of their subject knowledge. And that's vaguely worded, which would, I would say, empower the academic department to interpret that depending on the student's need and context. But the problem is the fact that the assessments team would also need to be involved in that, because that recommendation doesn't tell them anything about what they're going to be doing. It's like, I've recommended an alternative assessment, but they're the ones who do the exam operations. So what do they do? So then it's like, well, they're not going to make the decision because they don't know what the decision is. And the academic department isn't going to make the decision because I haven't specifically told them what the alternative assessment procedure is. And even if I did tell them what the alternative assessment procedure is, then the professional statutory regulatory body, the PSRB of that course, would also need to be included because they're the ones who approve the teaching, learning and assessment of that particular degree. So it becomes a bit of a problem. And then we also have the issue of, well, is it actually a reasonable adjustment for this particular module to have this sort of assessment that they want? Because the module required them to have a 3-hour exam. What they were asking for wasn't an exam at home, but what we call an extended exam, which would be either over 3 days or over 7 days, in which they would have to have a new exam paper written with different questions under a different set of circumstances, which would need to be invigilated differently. So then it became quite operationally very difficult. So eventually I hit upon the idea that, look, you know, the academic department would write the exam paper. I would approve this as a very specific recommendation for these modules. But as a consequence of that, what that had highlighted was a breakdown in the system. Because when we say who makes the decision, no one person can make a decision, because we make recommendations that we think are reasonable. But as became apparent, this might be put back and said, well, this is massively unreasonable. We can't do this at all. And so, well, let's sort of work it through then. So then it becomes a matter of a process. It becomes process driven. So then it becomes, look, if a student requires an alternative assessment as a complex adjustment, which may or may not be reasonable, then this would need to be explored. Who are the main stakeholders? So that student would need to be told, look, you know, you need to let us know what your requirements are by a certain point, because the students need to take responsibility. We would then discuss this as an operational level to include the academic department, the exams office, disability services, and if possible, any representation from the PSRBs. We would decide if it was feasible, and then we would say, look, what it would look like operationally, and then a decision would be made to contact the student to say that it's been approved, and then the decision as to what it would look like would rest with the academic department, because they're the ones who would have to produce the actual assessment process, which would then need to be put in place by the assessments team. So who decides what's reasonable and unreasonable? Essentially, I do. But realistically, it can be quite complex. Now, that's only about the assessments as well. We also have to deal with the issue, no, not deal, respond to the issue of students who would require very specific adjustments to the teaching and the learning as well. So again, if you look at the differences between an assessment process and a core competency is set in stone. So that's what absolutely has to be demonstrated. The assessment is essentially what the student is going to do to be able to do that. So we can talk about alternative assessments, but how that's taught is very, very different. So again, if we have students with, let's say, high anxiety or social communication difficulties, then what do we do in the event of, let's say, group work, where there's a requirement for the students to interact? You know, if we have teaching and learning that requires an element of interaction and social interaction, and we have a significant proportion of students on a course who have a condition that limits their ability to interact, then what's the reasonable adjustment? We can't say, you know, the student can access the course online without the lecturer saying, well, actually, pedagogically, this is what you absolutely need to do for the student. So we need to look at different ways in which the students would be able to interact, you know, either depending on the extent to which they're able to develop their own coping strategies, or use different means of interaction, whether it's an electronic Teams chat function, for example, or maybe via online, but in a very limited way. So there are ways in which it can be done. We have a student at the moment who's come in to study television and do media production, television, digital marketing. It's all very practical, with studio-based activities in the gallery, with reading auto cues and being able to film on mobile phones and do editing on the hoof. It's a very sort of practical course that requires a very definite set of skills. That student has autism and is blind. Well, right, okay, then there were some issues then as to how we put accommodations in place. And so it then becomes a matter of, working with the student as much as possible to say, look, this is the extent of which reasonable adjustments can work for you. So we would need to work, and which is what we're doing at the moment, working with the academic team to say, what technologies are you using, for the purpose of assessing the student's ability to demonstrate their core competencies? What alternative assistive technologies does the student have? Do we need to get in touch with the actual suppliers of the hardware and the software that we're using to see if they can put any adjustments in place? And then, can you demonstrate, can you come up with a means of teaching that student based on his particular set of circumstances, which can then be assessed at an appropriate level? So it can be quite complicated. So sometimes we do have to say to the student, we can't do this. But if we do that, then we need to be very careful that if it comes down to a complaint or an appeal, that we are absolutely sure of our position to say to a student that we don't think that what you've asked for is reasonable, because it's impractical, or it's too prohibitively expensive, or it would undermine the integrity of the course, or it would be unfair to other students. So the reasonable unreasonableness, it's not said in the Equality Act what it means. There's no definition of it. Again, like a lot in the Equality Act, it's open to interpretation.
So what I'm hearing is that, I'm sort of translating it slightly into the context where we're working, that we're not going to be able to come up with a neat definition of reasonable adjustments, which is going to sort of work across the board. We might have some, standard packages, as you say, which we know work in some contexts, but that in anything which goes beyond familiar ground, it's going to be a dialogue between student, the academic staff in the TEI, the sort of student support staff in the TEI, with people in Durham who are doing the validating, probably with an external examiner as well to provide an external view, and what is reasonable emerges out of that kind of dialogue, rather than out of sort of looking it up on a table or being able to go to the Equalities Act and sort of read it off.
Yeah. And again, having sort of worked in disability support for a number of years, on the one hand, yes. So what I've sort of explained there, isn't, let's say, how we would respond to all students who register with us as having a disability. Although we're quite a small institution, we've got 1,700 students and only 3 members of staff, within disability services, one of whom is on a 0.6 contract, so we don't have the time, to basically give all students that level of support. What we would do is we do have template student inclusion plans with a list of what we would think are the most commonly occurring or reoccurring recommendations for adjustments based on the students who present with the most commonly occurring or reoccurring conditions, which is usually mental health or the learning difficulties of dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, and ADHD, as an example. Because we can sort of get through those at the busy times of year relatively easily, that gives us time to then sort of explore with the students with the more complex needs, what would be reasonable and unreasonable. But again, there's scope for disagreement as well, because what would be unreasonable on one course would be perfectly reasonable on another. So we have students who are doing nursing degrees and counselling degrees and teaching degrees. Sometimes the nature of their disability would be such that, look, this is not possible for you to do this course, where it absolutely would be possible for them to do something like sociology or creative writing.
Thank you. I think it'd be good to move on maybe to some other examples. You've given us a few already, but sort of let's continue in this area to begin with of dyslexia, dyspraxia, and autism. I wonder if you can give us another example or two of the kind of reasonable adjustments that you end up making in that sort of area.
Yeah, I mean, so originally when I started working in disability support, it was mostly because of the number of students who were being diagnosed with dyslexia. So disability services used to be called dyslexia and disability services, and because that was sort of where the bulk of the students were, and they still constitute the largest cohort of students. And I think over the years, when it comes to supporting and responding to students with learning difficulties, specifically dyslexia, an awful lot of what we used to recommend as good practice is now, as a reasonable adjustment, is now sort of recognized as good practice. So if you kind of look at the general characteristics that we associate with dyslexia. And again, I'm being massively general here, but we talk about, problems with reading skills, but that might be slower than average. Written work can be poorly organized. Phonological processing, so difficulties processing speech sounds or units of sound within speech. Working memory information processing, dyslexic students may need longer than their non-dyslexic peers to make sense of new information. Time management, increased risk of stress and depression. If we're looking at reasonable adjustments, it's like, well, what would we do? It's like, well, we would probably say, well, on the whole, unless there was something very particular to the student, we would recommend to the student first, that we would provide them with some sort of one-to-one support or recommend it from the academic department. We would highlight recommended reading lists for the student rather than just give them a list of 50 texts. We would say, here are the key texts that we would suggest that you read. We would provide them with a reading strategy, on how to read, locate the relevant information from the text, and also note-taking strategies as well. But also recommend things like the extra time in exams, rest breaks, use of a computer, extra time for assignments. Signpost them to screen readers for Microsoft Word and voice-to-text features also on Microsoft Word. Recording teaching sessions or permission to record teaching sessions is quite a big one. I mean, here at Leeds Trinity, it's now our digital policy that all teaching sessions should be recorded. So whereas maybe 15 years ago, I would recommend this to a member of staff and they would swoon and say, I've never heard the like. Now it's sort of done as a matter of policy anyway. If we've got, let's say, dyspraxia, with that, then it would be, well, additional options to practice any equipment that might be used as well, if it's on a vocational course or a practical course as well as if it's not a specific learning outcome or core competency, allowances made for errors with spelling, punctuation, and grammar. And also things like using, appropriately AI materials, like I don't know if anybody's heard of Google FM. Not Google FM, that's a radio station. Notebook LM on Google. It essentially turns a document into a podcast, which can be very, very handy for a student who has a very, very problematic relationship with the written word, but nonetheless can still get, the bulk of the material that from a text that's been suggested. So dyslexia it sounds a bit unfair to people who are dyslexic, but it's one of the least complex disabilities that we would suggest, because there are all sorts of mitigations that we can put in place. A lot of the reasonable adjustments, I think, would probably also come from the sort of support that they receive in terms of developing the skills for reading, writing, note taking, that sort of thing. What we find over the past few years, the other two sort of what we classify as learning difficulties, which is autism and ADHD, we have seen a huge increase in the number of students presenting with autism and ADHD. Now, again, for something like autism, it's a slightly difficult one because it is very much on a spectrum. So we do have a number of students who you wouldn't know to talk to or interact with that they have autism, but it affects them in just different ways. And then we do have students who are literally, mute and have absolutely no capacity to interact on a level that is often required of them in higher education. So the case study, that we would say would be, well, imagine that we have a student with autism and he's nonverbal and he has difficulty in social situations, so working in groups. He experiences high levels of anxiety and depression. He's very sensitive to noises and light, as occasionally happens. New places that are unfamiliar to him can cause panic. He responds positively to routine, which means that he responds very negatively to a break in that routine, and occasionally has meltdowns. So well, okay, then what would be our first instinct? Well, if there is, let's say, a problem with unfamiliar places, then we allow for orientation days. So if we know that the students come to the university, we give all students the option to come onto campus before they register with the course, to get to know the staff, get to know the campus, talk them through the course. So when they arrive on the campus, it doesn't seem as unfamiliar as it would have done if they just turned up on day one, or even turned up to their halls of residence the day before they were due to start. We also ensure that the timetable is adhered to as much as possible, because with the routine comes the clinging to the timetable, so this is your timetable. But we would also put as a recommendation the importance of making sure that advance warnings of any timetable changes, with details of any time changes or room changes, are given to the student as much as possible, and also to the student to say, look, if you miss a session, then that's very much disability related, so that you shouldn't be penalised for that. Providing lesson plans and lesson structures is also very handy, because I think one of the main areas of anxiety, particularly for students with autism, is the idea that if they're going to be in a classroom being taught, and they don't know if there's going to be a Q&A session or group work, then if they're told in advance, look, the requirements for you is to sit and listen and make notes, or there is going to be a Q&A session, but you can contribute if you like, and if you wanted to contribute, you would do so via this electronic system, that's a reasonable adjustment. We'd also say, look, if there's the issue of sensitivity to external stimuli, like noises and sounds and smells, for example, it would be, well, allow for noise cancelling headphones to be worn, close the windows as much as possible, dim the lights if necessary also. These are all sort of reasonable adjustments to help overcome, any issues that the students might have, with, let's say, filtering external information coming at them. And then, we would say check on academic progress, agree on the preferred means of communication, whether that's email or chat features, and also to minimize as much as possible any ambiguous words or phrases that's going to be used in the course of the session, or to provide, on request if necessary, any explanations as to words and phrases that are possibly going to be used as well. These are things sort of off the top of my head, that we would do as standard. But again, it does depend on the student as well. So some students will have note takers in the class with them. Some students will, let's say, have permission to leave the classroom whenever they feel as though that they need to. Other students will need help navigating the library, for one thing, because the library can be a very intimidating environment for a lot of students who don't know how the information systems work. So again, what we would do is we would send a draft inclusion plan to the student to say, this is what we do, this is what we would recommend. But we also give the option for the student to come back and say, well, this is what I would need, and then we can work from there also. So again, sorry, you look like you're about to say something, Mike.
Oh, no, Karen, I thought you were coming to an end, but Karen, do finish.
Yeah, so that's essentially it. So we would work with the template recommendations for students, but certainly with something like ADHD as an example, that's slightly different, because ADHD sits in that Venn diagram where it occupies the middle ground of mental health and learning difficulty. And the issue with ADHD is the fact that it's also comorbid with an awful lot of other conditions as well. So you get much higher than average comorbidity with stress, anxiety, depression. Sometimes some of the symptoms can be very, very similar to mental health conditions like OCD, as an example. It can also get worse as the student increases their academic skills. So unlike dyslexia, where you can reflect on and confidence build on, let's say, the developing of essay writing, of note taking, of developing the academic skills, talking to a lot of students with ADHD and staff, of whom we have quite a few, what they actually say is, look, actually, I become quite stressed because of the shame of needing the support. I become quite stressed, because I'm very self-conscious that my mind is working in such a way that it's not the fact that I'm distracted, it's more the fact that I'm equally as fascinated as everything everything that comes at me. I would the example I would give as an equivalent would be my brother, who has a hearing impairment and has recently been given hearing aids, and he'd spent years sort of having a diminished hearing acuity, and then he got some really expensive, really good hearing aids. He plugged them in, turned them up, and he said, this is too much. I can hear people's breathing. I'm now distracted by the sound of that bird outside. I can hear myself swallowing. I can, hear somebody walking down the street. And his brain had sort of over the years lost the capacity to naturally filter out external noises and external sounds. And so he had to sort of put in that filter. Now, if having spoken to, say, a good friend of mine who has ADHD, and she was a former lecturer who'd written about it, she said, look, what actually happens is everything is coming at you, and you can't focus on one thing, and you've got to do this other thing, but this other thing here is equally interesting, and then you start to procrastinate, and then the procrastination leads to a sort of self-realization that you're not doing well, and then you start to compare yourself with others, and then that's how the mind works, and then, oh my God, something else is happening over here. And so with the ADHD, then you find, that the students might then take medication, which then might have an impact depending on what the side effects of that medication are, whether it's going to affect their concentration or their mood or their energy levels. And from there, you would then need to update any student inclusion plan to take that into account, while also realizing that if they've taken medication for the first time, their sense of self is now being challenged, because who they were was how they perceive the world. Now they're perceiving the world and themselves in very different ways. So the recommendations for support and the actuality of support for students with particularly ADHD should be very different, because it needs to be quite pastoral. It needs to be quite supportive, in a way that addresses how they feel about the course, how they feel about themselves. So when I spoke to a colleague of mine last week who has ADHD, she said, look, you get worse in terms of how you feel about yourself and your condition, and it impacts you much worse because you procrastinate more, because you seem to get less done, because you compare yourself to other people. And the interventions that are required would need to be quite regular, in order for the student to be given the right reassurances, but also the right guidance on how to manage the time, given the fact that their ability to concentrate and focus is in many ways greatly diminished.
Thank you for that. Now I'm aware that sort of time is marching on a bit, and just to sort of let people in the audience know that there are sort of chapters in the book on all sorts of areas beyond the dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, chapters on mental health, on visual impairment and blind students, on deaf and hearing impaired students, physical impairments, and students with long-term medical conditions. I don't think we're going to be able to go through all of those in the next few minutes, but I wonder, Stephen, if I don't know whether we should sort of pick out a couple of those areas for you to talk us through a bit more. And perhaps mental health is, we've already touched on a bit, but that's one where I know from the Durham end we're hearing a lot more by way of student self-reporting and staff raising concerns about how to respond to students who are presenting with mental health difficulties.
Yeah, this is quite problematic, because there is no such thing as just mental health. There's so many different conditions that come with it, and also the fact that students can self-identify much more readily as having a mental health because they're the expert in themselves. Now, what I would say is one of the dangers of support, if we use the S word, for students with mental health, is that we are, I'm assuming, mostly non-mental health specialists, unless of course you actually are. But for the most part, and unless you are a mental health specialist and a registered and accredited counsellor or therapist, for example, then we're going to be put in a position where we have to provide mental health support without being a mental health provider of support. So going back to what I said about the ADHD, that fine line between pastoral support and mental health support is a very difficult one. What I'd say to that is lots of students often feel as though the support and attention that they receive from their favourite lecturer or their most responsive tutor is the mental health support. So the first thing to be very clear on is what your professional boundaries are when it comes to supporting students with mental health, because a lot of students with mental health will offload an awful lot of their personal issues and how they're thinking and feeling, and often use it as a therapy session. This can be quite triggering for members of staff, because an awful lot of students with, let's say, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder might be wanting to talk about events in their lives which you might not be equipped to deal with. in many ways. And even if you have been given sort of training, in PTSD or training, in that sort of thing, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are under any obligation to listen to very problematic experiences that students want to disclose. So the first thing that I would always say is be aware of your professional boundaries, and also ensure that the student is aware of your professional boundaries. Because if you have a student who is, let's say, regularly coming to you for pastoral sessions, more than you think would be, averagely expected from a student, then I think the thing to do is sort of keep an eye on what you think the student's expectations are, but also to ensure that the student is aware at the beginning of, let's say, any meeting that you have with them, what the nature of the session is, and be very clear that, you would need to signpost them to any relevant services, let's say within your institution or externally, let's say, so the NHS mental health crisis, for example. But I think if a student comes to you and says, I have mental health, what do I do? Often we can feel on the back foot, feel as though, we have to sort of respond immediately and know what to do. So think of it as an information gathering exercise first. And I think the first thing that I would do is say, look, firstly, what is the nature of the mental health? Is it anxiety? Is it depression? Is it OCD? Does the student know? Because, does the student know? So does the student know if they have anxiety and depression? And then if so, we can say, well, has the student self-identified? So are they saying, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling, very stressed? And then you can say, look, well, in that case, have you been officially diagnosed or previously treated? So that's giving you some indication as to whether or not the student, is coming to you because of just something that they're feeling, or something that is chronic and long term. If you ask about the sort of support that they've received, then again, that tells you that they're no strangers to receiving specialist advice. And then you can ask, look, have you been medically diagnosed? Are you on medication? So again, it puts the student in the situation of being able to sort of say what needs to be said without you sort of responding, let's say, in any kind of therapeutic way as to what they would like. And then you're in a situation where you're saying, well, okay, who is most likely to support the student? What does this student actually need, either from myself or from the institution? So if the student says that they're not currently receiving any mental health service, any mental health intervention, and you know that you have a mental health service, or you have, let's say, the contact details of a local mental health trust, you can suggest to the student that that is probably something that they would need to access themselves, if they need any sort of specialist intervention. Then you're saying, well, going back to what is disability, where is the disablement located? Are we talking about, let's say, a chronic condition which has been exacerbated by something environmental? Now, if you look at the recent reports that recently came out on student suicides in the UK, then there is an uptick of suicides and self-harming around assessment periods. So at what time of the year is the student presenting themselves to you? And do we have to, let's say, look at, let's say, last minute exam adjustments? Do we need to, let's say, signpost to academic skills services? That sort of thing. It depends. So the first thing that you would do is sort of decide what those interventions are likely to be based on what information that you actually have. Now, if we say that we have, let's say, more complex cases, as we had the other year actually, where a student came to us and said, well, I've got schizophrenia. Right, okay then. And that student had received extensive treatment, including being sectioned in the past. And he said that he'd stopped taking his medication and has become paranoid and irrational, and he's upsetting other students and staff because of his increasingly vocal extremist views, which he was having difficulty controlling. So, well, okay then, this is now sort of beyond the scope of any one individual. So this is the point where we're talking about escalation. And I think what you're not doing is putting yourself in savior mode by saying, I will help you. What you are saying is, look, this will probably need to be escalated because a risk assessment for the student self and others maybe need to be considered. We may need to contact a trusted other, so either a parent or a mental health team, a GP or a social worker, if necessary, if the student has that information and wishes to disclose it. Agree things like online accessing of teaching sessions instead of in person, so that way that the student can be muted if they do start to voice problematic opinions. And also things like a condition of continuation, maybe on the basis of an agreed behavior contract, which may or may not be semi-legal, but it's what we did anyway. Which is very different from, let's say, a student, who comes to us with depression and anxiety, who says that they're taking medication and they have some side effects. They experience high anxiety in unfamiliar places when asked to speak in public, which can lead to procrastination and disengagement, and the symptoms are exacerbated around assessment periods. So we already know exactly, well, actually, if with the reasonable adjustments here would be make allowances for fluctuating attendance, ensure teaching materials are made available online, ensure that alternative means of engagement, are given, give the students a choice of seating, explore the alternative assessment if they're not already embedded within the curriculum, and provide one-to-one teaching sessions or one-to-one catch-up sessions for any missed session. You sort of say, well, what's the bare minimum that we can do? As a good grounding. What's the disablement here? Where is it located? What would we need to do? But also, what would be the students' responsibilities here? Because don't forget that we're not here as a professional service to cure students or even treat students. We are, educators. That's our primary function. So the purpose is, what do we need to do in order to ensure that this student can access the course on an institutional level? If they need anything specialist, then we ain't specialists, so we're not going to be providing any specialist support for them.
Thank you. I think looking at the time, we might need to draw this part of the webinar to a close. I'm aware that there are all sorts of other areas we could have gone into, and people may want to ask questions about things that we've not really had a chance to cover yet. As I say, there are chapters on visually impaired students, hearing impaired students, physical impairment, students with long-term medical conditions, and so on. But can I say for now, thank you so much for the answers you've been giving and drawing on your sort of wealth of practical expertise in handling this in a rather different institutional context from ours, but one with lots of sort of overlaps and connections. But now is an opportunity for the next 25 minutes or so for any of you to ask questions of Stephen, either to go over something that he's already touched on or to go into some of the areas we didn't get to. So I'm wondering if anyone would like to stick up their electronic hand. So Rebecca, you're first. Do feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I just wondered about, 25% extra time in the exam is very clearly defined and straightforward. But I just wonder what the norm might be, say, for a dyslexic student, for extra time with an assignment that they're doing in their own time. Does the clock begin when the module began at the beginning of term, and they've got to produce the piece of work X number of weeks later? What would be a reasonable extra?
It depends. I will probably answer every question with the bill of it depends. I think it depends on a number of ways. So it could be down to the marking timetable could be a determining factor. So we have students, for example, who put in for additional time and additional time on top of the additional time, but we do have to say to them, look, if you have a piece of work that's marked with 5 days, so one week extra, then that would be reasonable. But occasionally they'll say, well, actually I need 10 days. We say, well, that's going to impact on how we mark and when we mark your assignment, which could impact on your progress to either the next level, the next term, or even to your graduation ceremony. So there's no sort of one standard amount of time that works for all students, because some universities will say you can only have 5 days, because that's the cutoff point before our administrators need to process students from going from one part of the course to the other and then to graduation. But we would probably say 5 working days would be an average, because that's what we work with. But then we also have mitigating circumstances on that, but it would be followed up with, look, these would be the consequences in terms of your student journey.
Right. May I just ask a follow-on question? Because if you've got a student who, let's say, is dyslexic, but they're also clearly very anxious about the assignment, and I don't know, it might be they've got pressures at work or their dog died, or I just wonder to what extent you count on kind of cumulative time as if each thing were a separate issue, or what point they're amalgamated into a a kind of a limited threshold?
Yeah, it's a good question, because we get this a lot with students who come to us with multiple disabilities, but sort of stagger those disclosures over the course of the year. So if we had a student with dyslexia and we said, right, you can have 25% extra time in exams and you can have 5 days extra, for coursework, that's fine. And then say, well, I now have anxiety and depression, which is also impacting me. It doesn't follow that the more diagnoses that you have, the more adjustments you get, because we have students who have ADHD and dyslexia and anxiety, but they're still going to get the 25% extra time in the 5 days. So anything on top of that would need to be considered on an individual basis on what the student needs, and going back to, is it reasonable or unreasonable? Because the students are on a course, and the course is a well-oiled machine mostly, which means that in order for that engine to keep running, we need to ensure that the students produce their work in good time. If it becomes apparent that even, let's say, with extra time and mitigating circumstances on top of that as well, if we're being as flexible as possible, that they still are having difficulty doing the work, then we're in fitness to study territory. Which is because we're saying, look, we can't give you more time because that's not reasonable. That just means it's in fact, if anything, it's unethical on our part, because we're taking your tuition fees and you're getting nothing out of it.
Thank you. Ellie is next, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. This is so helpful, really fascinating. My question is about what is reasonable to expect from students. I'm thinking particularly in terms of working in partnership with students to enable good learning and teaching to happen, and us being able to make reasonable adjustments, but what it might be appropriate to ask from students in terms of medically treating a disability or developing appropriate coping mechanisms. I suppose I'm thinking about students who start with us who have lots of the signs and symptoms of ADHD, and you think, oh my goodness, your learning is going to be helped massively if you're able to take some medication to help you or develop some different coping strategies. Where's the sort of relationship and appropriateness around that?
Yeah. I would probably say that if you're asking that question, then you're probably thinking, what's the specialist intervention that's required for the student? And the point of a reasonable adjustment is that it's non-specialist. So we wouldn't expect a non-specialist in a particular area to provide specialist support for any particular student with any particular disability. So I'll give you an example, which is not ADHD related, before I sort of get on to answer that question. But we had a couple of students a few years ago, and they were both wheelchair users who had been both born twin sisters, paralyzed from the neck down. They needed regular physiotherapy treatment, which included times from when they were on the campus. We're not providing the physiotherapy treatment, but we are providing the room and the bed and the hoist for that treatment to take place. If we have a student with ADHD, then what we're essentially talking about is where's the disablement? So if there's issues with concentration, then it's access to the technology. So are we recording the teaching sessions? Are we ensuring that lecture notes are available in advance? Are we ensuring that the student has access to the reading list and knows where to find the reading materials? Can you provide, let's say, any catch-up sessions for the student or any supplementary lessons to guide them on where they are? It's not our role to recommend medication because we don't know what the medical condition is of the student, and we also don't know what their attitude to medication is, because as you've probably noticed, we're finding more and more people having very different attitudes towards mainstream medication. So some students might, as a matter of principle, not want medication. Other students might have tried it, or there might be let's say cultural reasons as to why they may not wish to take the medication. So we're talking about what's the minimum as our starting off point, for the student. So we know that their learning is going to be affected because of their condition, and so how are they learning? How am I designing this learning environment, in a way that could possibly be exclusionary? You know, are they going to fidget? Well, if they are, you know, say that it's fine, because one of the issues is saying to students who, you know, with ADHD or autism where stimming might be involved, is look, don't worry about fidgeting. Stand up if you have to. You know, leave
I
the
give
room
pipe
if you
cleaners
have to.
in every session I teach.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, so what we say, look, you know, don't deny being you. You know, we accepted you for who you are. So don't try and be somebody else. Don't try and conform to an environment where that we're trying to adapt. And so if a student, let's say, needs to leave the room to walk around and then come back and get the thoughts together, that's absolutely fine. That's a reasonable adjustment. You know, that's what you would do. So the learning doesn't necessarily need to take place in this, you know, from this time till this time. That's where your learning happens. It's over a broader period as well. So you've designed a teaching class. You've said to the student, this is, you know, sort of what you would need to do in terms of you turn up, you pay attention to as much as possible. We will then talk about and reflect upon what you have learned and what you've understood. I will give you additional guidance. You can have the extra time. These are all reasonable adjustments, you know, as well. But no one would expect you to be a specialist in ADHD providing the sort of interventions that, let's say, somebody with a background in ADHD support would provide.
Thank you. You're
does that
mentioning,
does that answer the question? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
You mentioned in passing there recording sessions, which reminded me to say to those who joined after I made the announcement at the beginning that we are recording this and the video will eventually go up online, and that includes your questions, though we will we edit it so that your image doesn't appear, but when you ask a question your voice will appear. Is there anyone who would like to ask the next question? Please stick up your electronic hand. I won't otherwise be able to see you. Keith.
Thank you, Stephen, for what you said so far. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how you handle the tensions where you get someone asking for adjustments where there isn't, for example, a formal diagnosis. So if someone comes along and says, I think I might be dyslexic, do you effectively have to pretty much take them at their word and give them adjustments? Or what kind of evidence can you look for? How far can you expect them to support their claim?
Yeah, again, this is a very good question, because it goes to the heart of at what point does disability begin? So does it begin at the point at which symptoms occur? Does it begin at the point at which diagnoses are made? Does it begin at the point at which discrimination is likely to occur? Our policy that I changed a couple of years ago was to not insist on having any medical evidence to prove a disability. So if a student comes to us and says, I have dyslexia, rather than I think I've got dyslexia, then we take it at face value. Now, if the student wants to apply for things like disabled students allowance, which is government money to spend on more specialist support, then they do need diagnostic evidence because money is involved. But as far as we're concerned, the support begins at the point at which the student makes it known to us that they are disabled or have a condition which could be disabling. If you look at the Equality Act makes no reference to students or anybody providing evidence of a disability. So I know a lot of universities do insist on evidence, but we don't. So we don't say we need a doctor's note or anything. If we ask for this, it will be so we're more informed as to the sort of support that we can provide, or to advise on whether or not it's appropriate for an application for disabled student allowance. Now, if a student comes to us and is exhibiting, let's say, characteristics that are consistent with a particular disability or condition like dyslexia, then we're sort of going back to what we said about the Equality Act and the Natasha Abrahart case, where evidence is what a student says or does or is observed to do. So that would mean that, look, you know, is it apparent that this institution needs to be a bit more inclusive in the sort of support that that student requires? And could that be disability related? If a student comes to us and says, I think I might be dyslexic, what can you do? Well, we would just basically pay for them to have an educational psychological assessment. You know, we would say, look, you know, if you wanted a full ed psych report done, you know, contact this company. It's a qualified bunch of it's a company that basically does dyslexia tests, and we'll pay for it. And if it comes back as positive, great, you know, we'll put all the support in place, as you know, and you know, advise on disabled student allowance. But that's the only occasion where we would do this. If a student comes to us and says, I think I have autism or ADHD, but I've never been tested, or somebody says, well, I'm on the waiting list, but it's the waiting list is longer than the duration of my course. What can we do? Again, it's like, well, okay, then we would then sit down and say, well, let's sort of go where you are at the moment. Tell us about your experience of being a student who may or may not have a particular condition. Tell us where the disability lies. Tell us what support looks like to you. What would we recommend? Because if we write a student inclusion plan for a student with no confirmed diagnosis, but they suspect that they have ADHD or autism or any number of disabilities, then we're not going to say that we're not going to support you or put adjustments in place, because firstly it would be unethical and the student would go away saying, well, I didn't get anything from there. That's a bad experience. But also that we would absolutely be in breach of the Equality Act, because that student is clearly highlighting, characteristics that are consistent with a disability. So we would say, look, what can we do that would be reasonable? Because any reasonable adjustment doesn't undermine the course, in any particular way. And if it did, it wouldn't be reasonable. So if a student says, look, I've got autism because I have, slow processing difficulties, but I've never been tested, then we can absolutely put adjustments in place on the basis of that, and it wouldn't be a problem.
Sorry, can I just ask those who aren't talking at the moment, just make sure they're muted? We're getting a little bit of sound coming through. Thank you for that, Stephen. Are there other questions that people would like to ask? I think just one thing to say in response to one of the things that happened in the chat before I come back to Ellie is, we are, I set things up by asking the legal question at the beginning, and we are, in complex and differing ways, but we are governed by those legal frameworks. We may have other reasons and rationales, including theological ones, for trying to act well in this situation, but we also need to bear in mind that we're governed by these legal frameworks, which will shape what we do. So it's very important that we're informed about them. So Ellie first, and then we'll come to Ruth.
I'm very happy if you want to go to Ruth first, because I've already had a question, so I'll defer to Ruth.
Okay, we'll go to Ruth first and then come back to you, Ellie.
Sorry, just trying to find the mic thing. I just have a question, and it's probably because I myself have ADHD and I missed this. But what did you say about if a student comes to a university and they seem like they have autism or ADHD quite clearly and they're struggling, but they don't kind of admit it or they haven't said it themselves? What do you do then? Did you say something about that? I think I missed it.
Yeah, I touched upon it, but I can address it. We sort of have to go with what the student would like. So this is sort of where staff training comes in, because disability services wouldn't notice this because we only really see students who are either referred to us or disclosed to us. So information sharing, training, staff training on awareness is quite vital to this, because if a member of staff notices that the student, is exhibiting all the characteristics of ADHD, then what we would say to that staff member is, look, your job is to ensure that the student gets the best possible service from the university. Disability, any disability, isn't a taboo. You can mention it, and so you can, ask the student, you seem to be struggling. Is there anything that we as an institution can do? Have you, and there's nothing wrong in even asking, have you ever been tested for any, learning difficulties before? And if the students get offended with that, then that's fine. You've asked a perfectly reasonable question. And then if the student will say, well, actually, yes, I am struggling, what could I possibly do? What's on offer? Then we can have the conversation to say, well, let's put the student inclusion plan in place. Let's kind of see what adjustments that we can, discuss. And, we can give you some information on how to explore a formal assessment if that's something that you would like, diagnostically. But it has to come from the student. Otherwise, we're just imposing support on people, without their consent. Mm-hmm. So giving students, going back to the original question, the original question about students' responsibility, it is the students' responsibility to engage. And if they voluntarily engage, that's absolutely fine. But they need to be given the option that if, going back to the Abrahart case, a student, evidence is what a student says or does. And if the student is doing something that is suspected to be disability related, and they're given the option, to, discuss support and adjustments, but they decline, then that's their responsibility to make that decision.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks.
So let's come to Ellie now.
Thank you. picking up on that bit about the Abrahart case, and this, I may have misunderstood that, but did I hear you say something along the lines that staff have responsibility to offer support if a disability is disclosed or observed?
Yeah.
That's I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts around that, because there's something around how well equipped we are if we observe something. We're not diagnosing, but
yeah.
to, you know, where the sort of responsibility lies in terms of, that makes it sound very legal and I don't mean that, but what's our duty of care in a way to present with somebody who you clearly think, yes, you've got dyslexia. I've taught loads of people.
Yeah.
This sounds really familiar. But other times it's like, whoa, you know, there's other things that I don't know. Just your thoughts on that would be really appreciated.
Yeah, my thoughts are very confused on the subject. If I'm going to be absolutely honest, when I was looking at the guidelines based on the Abrahart case, I did roll my eyes and think, what do you mean? What does this mean in practice? How are we expected, you know, to sort of make a determination as to whether or not something is disability related if we don't know all the disabilities? Now, I think just so I would say, to give you some reassurances, you know, I'd say, look, you know, when we're not going to be expected to essentially diagnose students with particular disabilities based on their observed behavioural characteristics. What we're looking at as professional educators is whether or not the student is as fully included within the learning environment as possible, and if not, whether that exclusion is within your scope as a professional educator to do something about. So if you have a student with dyslexia, then you could say, look, am I structuring the session in such a way as to signpost it to when I'm moving on to something else? Are my lecture slides, let's say, too text heavy? Am I giving students the right advice on what reading list would be appropriate for this particular session? That sort of thing. Now, the thing is, with the Abrahart case, that came about very specifically because, and I don't want to get into too much into the legal details, but universities have an active and constructive knowledge of disability, which means slightly different things. So I think a constructive knowledge of a disability means that when the university should have known that a student has a disability, but if they failed to do something about it, then they're in breach of the Equality Act. Active knowledge, I think, is when the student actually is when the university does know. So what we do, we have quite an integrated system where staff across the university can share information about students if there are any concerns about, let's say, mental health or well-being or academic study skills, for example. So I would probably say don't worry too much, because I think if you're, let's say, if you have a good understanding with the students, if you sort of know what the process is for getting hold of the information about what students have declared a disability, and if the students themselves know that they can disclose a disability, you know, then that's probably as much as we would expect you to do it in this instance.
Thank you. So I guess that there's a you know, one of the things we are asking of staff is not to be experts in all the possible diagnoses of mental health or disability, but to be experts in seeing when people are having difficulties engaging with the course, to notice when you know, someone's not able to participate in class activities, or where the, you know, things are clearly going wrong with assessment in some way. Those are the things where we can expect staff to pick up where things might be wrong and to open conversation or signpost. Would that be a sort of fair way of putting it?
Yeah, because I think it's a matter of, so if we take the Abrahart case as an example, if a member of staff, you know, is put in a position where, you know, they say, look, you know, I don't want to do group work or deliver a presentation. Can you assess what I know differently? Then that's absolutely fine. You know, it shouldn't be a problem. You know, if, let's say, you know, the student says, you know, I need an alternative assessment, and also, you know, I don't want to turn up to this session at all, you know, because I find it too stressful, then that's a matter of saying, well, is that actually reasonable? You know, I'll probably need to sort of, you know, escalate this up to get, you know, advice and guidance, because if you're not sure, then don't give an answer either way.
Rebecca, probably our last question.
Yes, thank you. Just wondered, you mentioned earlier about anxiety, and you would ask, has somebody got a diagnosis? Do they take medication, etc.? If somebody's just anxious and they haven't got a diagnosis, been to their doctor, etc., I mean, how would you respond to that? Because to an extent, anxiety over assessments, exams is normal, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and this sort of goes to the problematic nature of the definition of disability, which is long term, over 12 months, and affects them on a daily basis. So but but what we would say is, look, we know that anxiety at exams is probably the deadliest time of the year, quantitatively for students in higher education. So it's not something that we would sort of take lightly. The question would be, so, well, okay, then how long have you been feeling like this? So the student could say, look, I only feel about like this during assessment period. So we know that the university has a responsibility here. It could be seasonal, with seasonal affective disorder, as an example. But I think if through questioning the student, or discussing it with the student, it becomes clear that the anxiety is driven because of their thought processes with regard to the assessment process, because they see it as a major threat. Then we say, well, what are the options here? Do we immediately leap to alternative assessments? Maybe not. Because it could be a matter of, well, would it be helpful if you got some specialist intervention, if your institution had a mental health and wellbeing service for coping strategies to help them deal with that sense of threat that they perceive, is coming from the exam itself. Equally, it could be the student has never had an exam before. They might have had a background that haven't required them to sit down for 3 hours and write long essays in a quiet room where all you can hear is the scratching of other people's pens. It could be like so new to them that it's like, well, that might be anxiety inducing, but would you need coping strategies, or would you need study skills? So study skills strategies to help go over exam techniques, to help them feel more comfortable with the process of the exam, understanding what exam questions look like, time management in exam. If you've got 3 hours to answer 4 questions, and what does that look like in terms of the amount of time you're spending to answer those questions? What does it mean in terms of your ability to recommend revision strategies and note-taking strategies? How does that translate into upskilling them to be able to go into an exam, to say, look, I know how to read the exam paper, I know how to interpret the question, I know how to manage my time, and I know how to plan my essays? That could be the reasonable adjustment. So again, you would need to sort of say, well, where is that anxiety mostly located, and what would be reasonable? So a reasonable adjustment, and the student can say, I just want an alternative assessment, but you are sort of required to say, well, if there's an alternative to that alternative, then that could be more of a reasonable adjustment than basically going through the bureaucratic rigmarole of saying, right, okay, then let's see what else we can do. So if the student doesn't know how to answer an exam question, then give them the skills to answer the exam question, and then see how they feel. But again, going back to the question, what's the student's responsibility? They need to come to you in good time about it.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
We do need to call a close to it then. We've got a couple of minutes over our time. I hope that hasn't inconvenienced anyone, but it's because we've been having such rich content and rich answers. So, Stephen, thank you so much for making time for us today. Thank you for your answers to my questions, answers to everyone else's questions, and thank you for writing your book as well, the details of which went into the chat a little bit earlier. But we're very much in your debt and very grateful for all you shared with us. So please, everyone, do either using the electronic version or unmuting yourself, let's say thank you in the now traditional way on the web to Stephen. So thank you.
Thank you. And what I would say is reassurance is I do mention the Bible in the introduction.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks both very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.